Hey there, it's Tara, and I'm back with Terapod number 2. This month, I'm hanging out with my pal Immorpher, a musician, a scientist, a retro FPS historian, just a good guy with whom I have a lot of overlapping interests. We talk about Quake, Doom, Blood, Duke Nukem, video game soundtracks, the tenets of good design, all kinds of stuff. It was a really good time hanging out with him. Be sure to check out his Bandcamp, his YouTube channel, his awesome Doom 64 Discord server. All those links are down in the description, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
That's perfect.
But yeah, man, thanks so much for taking an hour out of your week to chat with me. I know we had to dance around a little bit with our schedules, but I appreciate you accommodating, and yeah, it should be fun.
Yeah. It just happened to be a week where I had what they call a neutron beam time. That's your time to do the experiment, and you have to fit it in that window.
We first connected last summer when I published a love letter retrospective video about Doom 64 on my YouTube channel. And you found that video, you left a really thoughtful comment, and we started chatting about Aubrey Hodges' music, and then started connecting a little more on social media. I started checking out your YouTube channel where you share music you produce along with gameplay footage of whatever you're currently sinking your teeth into. And honestly, man, your channel is a pretty cool, it looks like a repository, right? Of like retro FPS gameplay footage.
Yeah. It's for a while there, I was not posting any video game stuff at all. It actually started on the Quake mapping Discord where I wanted to show them Quake 64. And so I had an unlisted video and I shared with them because they used to PC Quake. They don't know about Quake 64. And then I wrote a big, long description underneath, like the differences, what Quake 64 is like. And then the guy who runs a dump truck said, you should just make it public. And so people can see that stuff. So I'm like, okay. And I just post videos there of things I think that are cool.
Well, and I think since then, you've become a really unique and positively influential figure in the Doom community, man. You're really like a Doom 64 evangelizer. Like your Doom 64 Discord server is just awesome. I think it's one of the coolest little Doom 64 related corners of the internet. And
it's a little niche.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pick your brain about all of that stuff. But I want to start first with kind of a fun, open-ended softball question. No right or wrong answer here. But in your opinion, regardless of genre, what are the pillars of good level design? What resonates with you, whether you're playing a new game, a retro game, or even community created content like WODs and so forth? What elements make a level engaging and worth playing and replaying over and over?
So if you asked me this, let's say last year, I would have no clue because I didn't do any kind of level work before then. I just played games and I just enjoyed them. And I was like, oh, this somehow resonates for me. It wasn't until the end of last year where I actually started making my first Doom 64 map. And I've put it off for so long in doing it. So now I can think a little bit more about level design. For me, it's a balance because we all have certain gaming cultural backgrounds where we start off playing a certain game, then we move on to other games. So we have certain paths, what we get used to. And for me, for like retro FPS is there's a good balance between restricted and freedom. So you can think of like a total freedom as like an open world game. And then a restricted game, let's say that's like an on-rails shooter like Area 51 or Dino Crisis. And in the mid 90s to late 90s, there's like a little spot there where you'd had sequential levels, but in those sequential levels, you were free to explore them. They were what we call non-linear. And so that kind of gives you little spaces where you can explore a lot, but you don't get yourself too lost where you don't know where your objective is anymore. And so I enjoy a good 15 to 30 minute non-linear level where it feels like I still have freedom, but I'm not going to get lost. And I know these days, a lot of mappers like to push hour-long non-linear levels, and that can start to get tricky. I mean, there's instances where they've done a good job where you find a key and then voila, where you find the key was you're just right near the door where you need to be. But that still kind of makes things a little bit linear. So even though you're free to explore a level, it's still guiding you through a certain pathway. So I find balance between letting you explore, letting you feel like you're free, that you're in the environment, that you're immersed into it, but also chunking it up so it's still a guided journey that you can make real progress to the game. Because when you get to that level complete screen, that's a little boost, like saying, "Oh, look, I beat another level. Now I'm progressive forward, and there's no going back. So now I've permanently progressed in the game." So it's a fine balance.
Yeah, I like that you make that point, and you use the word linear a couple times, and I think that's funny because linear has almost become a dirty word when it comes to video games and video game design. I think a lot of people hear linear, they think, oh, that's boring, that's straightforward. But I think we're in the same camp there, where I think a game can be too wide, too open.
Yes.
It feels not curated enough. You can't pick up on that artistic vision. And I think there is that fine balance, like you said, with some puzzle elements. You're trying to find secrets. Maybe you're trying to find a key. The key is in a different part of the level than the door that the key opens. So yeah, and I think you're right. Like those 90s FPS titles, a lot of the build engine and early id tech games,
Yeah.
there was such a cool era there when I think groups of designers just hit a sweet spot, with level design where, like you said, there was that balance. The levels weren't completely linear, in that there was a lot of exploration. There was a lot of thinking that you had to do as the player to find your way through. And I feel like because there's so many associations that a person can have specifically with id Software's classic games, Doom 2, Quake, as well as Doom 64, whose development was obviously outsourced to Midway. There's so many key ingredients that make those games special, that make them so replayable. It's the music, right? It's the arsenal, like the actual weapons you use, how they sound, how they feel. It's the art direction, the colors. But for me, the level design is probably king. I mean, other than what I would call feel, meaning like movement, running in Quake, jumping. Other than that, to me, there's really nothing more important to those games than the design of like the actual pathways and the enemy placement and where the secrets are, where the traps are. Do you feel similarly that level design alone is a big reason why you continue to be drawn to these games?
Yeah, I think that's a particular spot where the game designers are free in those titles. So Quake and Doom, they're known to be somewhat simplistic mechanically. You don't jump in Doom. You focus on shooting. In Quake, you jump, but they take away the use button. So you're pushing buttons. So they keep the controls very simple. That means you're not like an RPG where you're like leveling up your character. You're not, or like a fighter game where you're learning specific combos all the time, even though you can do weapon switching in Quake. It's so you have simple mechanics where it's easy to learn, but to make a game good, you have to have it easy to learn, but also have to have it hard to master. And the hard to master part comes into how they design the levels and how they place the enemies and how they use the enemies in those levels. You're right, where a lot of these retro FPS games do shine is in their level design. And it took going from the old, because even though Doom's ray casting, but I'm going to refer to like Wolfenstein or some of those other games around the same time, like Corridor 7 or Blake Stone, where in those levels, the designer was restricted so much that it was hard to make areas that are visually distinct to each other. When Doom came out, you could adjust the sector heights and then you're swapping textures. You didn't have just a single texture on the ceiling or floor. You can change those textures as you go along. So a big environment, a real environment, started to feel like a real environment now because you're walking through it, you're in a different spot, it looks different. While in those previous games, it's not that way. And that's what allowed those levels to start to shine. And then eventually now you get to modern games where if you want to just make a level up by yourself, well, good luck. You can lay it out, but then someone else has to come in there and start detailing up for you. But then it was a sweet spot where one level designer, it was their baby and they could shine and design that. And that's why we talk about like all of the level designers, Doom and Quake, like American McGee, John Romero,
Right.
Sandy Peterson. They have a flavor that if you're playing the games, it's like, oh, I can sense that artist flavor. And that's the same with Doom 64 that went on Midway. You got Tim Hadar and all the other level designers as well, where they have their own artist touch in them now.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can play Doom 2 and it's like, okay, here's a Sandy Peterson level. Like the more you play the game, You learn like, what you don't like, what this designer's sensibilities were, what this designer's sensibilities were like. And I definitely want to get much more specific and dive much more into like Doom 64 with you. But this topic of retro FPS games, I want to pick your brain about that, a little bit more, because I'm working on a love letter video to Quake 1 right now that's somewhat similar in format to that Doom 64 video I did, which I know you saw. And in it, I'm making a real point to explore and try to explain why I feel games like Quake and Blood and Doom 64 and Duke Nukem 3D, why these games remain so good, like so infinitely playable, really in a class of their own. All those, like I said, great build engine and early tech games. But without sounding like a crotchety old man, I know that lots of gamers today, when they hear the term FPS, they don't think of Doom 64. They think of Call of Duty. They think of Apex Legends, right? And I think lots of people do think that FPS games are dull based on their limited experiences with them. They think they're vapid experiences. And like some are, certainly. But the best FPS games, there is stimulating. I mean, you were talking about that kind of what goes into that experience of playing like a great 15 to 30-minute map. A game like Doom 64, some of those maps, I mean, those are as stimulating, as any levels in any games I've ever played. Quake 1 and Doom 64 are definitely at the top of my personal list, from that fast twitch, fast paced combat and movement, to the puzzles, the more intellectual aspects of the game. I think these retro FPS classics today, they're sort of like semi-kept secrets. Like if you know, you know. Do you see it that way as well? And like, just what are your thoughts in general on this topic? Do you feel that the FPS genre still gets kind of a bad rap, and that there are gamers out there who don't know what they're missing out on?
I think it's probably still the case now, but it's changing a bit, because it was definitely true, let's say 10 years ago, before the retro FPS boom. Because when Doom 2016 came out, and then there was Brutal Doom around that same time, and then Dusk came out, an early access around similar time, it was like a trifecta where people often started playing Doom 2016, and then Doom 2016 had one step in the modern, one foot in the past, where, because you weren't reloading, you had some levels that were non-linear, you did have some linear levels as well, but you had that little bit of ability to explore.
And they even put those classic levels in the game. And if you had never played classic Doom, that just gets you curious right away when you stumble into one of those.
Yeah. Then with Doom Eternal, Doom 64 came free with pre-orders. So I've seen so many people first through Doom 2016 who were like, yeah, to be honest, it was mostly people our age after playing Doom 2016 said, oh man, I remember how great these games were. Let me go back and play them. But then with Doom Eternal, you got a lot of younger crowd coming in saying, oh, I got Doom 64 as a freebie. I played it, and now I'm exploring back now to see what these games were like. Because there's people on Twitter that are a decade to 2 decades younger than me who are Doom 64 evangelists that are known more for Doom 64 than I am on Twitter. If you would ask me, like, I would have never believed that. I can see why Call of Duty appeals to young kids. It's so, I wouldn't say purely realistic, but you have all these fancy detailed guns. The graphics look fantastic. You can play online, multiplayer easily, and you can talk trash to other kids online. So I can understand why they were into them. I never expected the younger generation to also play these classic games and enjoy them. And I mean, for sure, not everyone's going to enjoy them, because we all have different backgrounds. If you're into like Minecraft and stuff, you may not enjoy some of these first-person shooters just for how their gameplay evolves. But I've seen all these young people come in, and I was like, are they going to hate Doom 64, or are they going to hate this game? Because when Doom 64 came out, the late 90s was a very turbulent period in terms of trying to chase that technology wave. And Doom 64 was not viewed too favorably by the general public. The reviewers were a little bit nicer to it, but the general public often wrote in letters how they disliked it. So, but for these late 90s games, or these mid 90s, because Doom was 1993 and people love that. So I guess to say 90s games in general. So at the right spot where the game designer could express enough of what they wanted to make a good game. And seems like it's still lasting. Now it's still being recognized that these were the forebearers of first-person shooters that really established what it was as a genre. And for people that want to understand what it's like as a genre, they're playing these games, and they're not going back and playing the Call of Duty sequels. I mean, they're playing the modern ones for sure, but it's like you play that and then you dump it and move on. With Doom, Quake, Duke Nukem, you play it a year later, you come back to it, and it's like a yearly thing now for these people that they will replay these games and explore, and sometimes discover a secret that they've never seen before, or some sort of weird random AI. Like how a lot of these old games, AIs were based on random number generation, and you can see them end up in places where you didn't think they would be. It's through just random chance they can seem smarter than they are, and you still discover and find unusual things decades later.
Right. Well, and isn't it interesting how Doom 64 has actually aged more gracefully than some of the games of that era that were chasing
I
new
wouldn't I
technology
wouldn't
we
have
talked about?
expected that. That was kind
Yeah.
of a surprise to me, because like I recognize nostalgia as a powerful thing, and I recognize I'm blinded by just not just Doom 64 but N64 games in general, and because I know what kind of reputation that they had for being muddy, blurry, and visually unappealing. But then to see Doom 64 come out of it, and people saying that they like the way the game looks, and it's like, well, I guess I'm not such a weirdo after all.
Well, and that's cool that you're, I think you especially being more tapped in with the Doom 64 Discord server you have, that's encouraging that you feel like you've heard from enough people and talked to enough people, like you said, who are even younger than you,
Mm-hmm.
and they're rediscovering or discovering for the first time a game like Doom 64, and it's clicking. Like for the people who are patient and curious enough to give it a shot. Yeah, well, I think it says a lot about the game, right? About the timelessness of that game, of the other classic id games. But I feel like this is a good segue because I want to back up a little bit and learn more about you and your gaming history. How long have you been gaming? And I know you mentioned N64. I grew up with the N64 too, but what were your early gaming experiences like, and when did you first encounter Doom and Doom 64 specifically?
When I was young, I didn't know much about gaming. I never asked for a video game console, but I think it was after like first grade or something, late 80s, and my parents had the regular Nintendo plugged into the TV set and they were playing it. And I was like, what is this? And so to see like my parents having like a controller and moving something on the TV would blew my mind. And it was specifically Super Mario Brothers. So that was my first console, was the NES, and the first game was Super Mario Brothers. And ever since then, the gaming grew on me. Because then I had the Super Nintendo. And I think around that time, when the Super Nintendo was out, I remember going to a friend's house and his dad had Doom on a laptop. Now, for kids these days, they're used to these nice laptops, like where the screen's very sharp. Back then, laptops would have what they call ghosting. So if you moved your mouse,
Right.
the frame rate won't, well, the frame rate would catch up, but the screen responsiveness wouldn't catch up. So you would lose your mouse. So they would put these ghosting trails behind the mouse so you can see where it would go. And they had Doom on there. And you can imagine, because Doom is a fast-paced game, you can imagine trying to move. It was so hard to see where you were going because the refresh rate of the screen was just so low. I don't know why that stuck in my memory, but I remember seeing that. But I didn't get a good look at it. And actually, I can still remember some of just seeing some of the geometry in my head and how blurry, and how I can't actually make out if it was like the E1, M1, the hangar, the first level or not. But the first time I really got exposed to Doom was actually Doom 64 on the Nintendo 64. So I remember getting the Nintendo 64 on my birthday. I was a teenager then. And so I was angsty. I'm still an angsty teenager at heart. And I remember getting my Nintendo 64, and I didn't get Doom right away. I can't remember what year, if it was like 96 or 97, got my N64, but I remember going to the game store and seeing that Doom 64 on the shelf there. And the case for Doom 64 is just the pentagram logo with the title. It's
Right.
oh, and so it's not, it doesn't really tell you, it doesn't really give you much hints of what you're in for. And I was an angsty teenager, and I remember all the stories about Doom, of how mature and how violent it was. And, I was into Mortal Kombat too. So I was like, okay, I just have to grab this. So I did grab Doom 64, like maybe late 97 or 98. And I played a bit of it, and I was like, wow, I like this atmosphere. I like how edgy it is, Like back then I would watch professional wrestling, and my favorite wrestler was The Undertaker. So it's like, of course, I would like the atmosphere of Doom at 64. Actually, for that time period, I actually played more Duke Nukem 3D because of its multiplayer than I did of Doom
Mhm.
64. But Doom 64 was a slow burn for me because like over time, I started preferring going back and playing Doom 64 than I did Duke Nukem 3D. It had more replayability for me each time I would go play Doom 64. I was like, oh wow, that wall is a weird color, or I'll get further and further in levels and see something I didn't expect. Like I'd find the secret level in the void, like this blue aqua void. Like, what the hell is this? And so that would make me want to come back. And over the decades, Doom 64 became more of a game I'll come back to and get more and more obsessed with. And funny story is like, because my memory of the original Doom was so vague,
Right.
I thought Doom 64 was what the original Doom looked like. And part of the problem was I was downloading music. It wasn't Napster, but it was something similar. And I was like, okay, I want the Doom soundtrack. And what, because Doom was MIDIs and these file sharing services were only sharing MP3s. So I got the PlayStation Doom soundtrack, which is the same composer of Doom 64. It's
Yeah,
like,
right. Aubrey
okay,
Hodges did that.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So I'm like, okay, so PC Doom must be just like Doom 64. So when I played the PC Doom, I was like, hey, wait a second, this is not Doom 64. Like Doom 64, then I slowly realized, like, hey, this is the third in the series. With the N64, also, so I had Duke Nukem, also had Quake 64, I had
Mhm.
Hexen, I had GoldenEye, was N64 famous shooter, then Perfect Dark, which was a good one. And then there was like Turok on there as
Yep.
well. And I got so obsessed with these violent, moody, semi a linear level first person shooters when the next generation of gaming came out. So that was like the GameCube, the PS2, eventually the Xbox, but the Xbox wasn't a thing yet. It was more like the Dreamcast. And they were not advertising the next shooters in that style. I actually quit gaming for like a decade or two. I
Mhm.
was like, oh man, because I was still edgy then. I was still an angsty teen. I'm still kind of that way, but I realized where to enjoy it properly. But yeah, I ended up quitting gaming for a while after that, and then eventually I got back into it because my wife was into more modern games and she started introducing me to things. And then when all this retro FPS stuff started coming back, then I really just took the deep dive and was like, okay, I'm in this now. I want to participate.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I feel like another name to throw out there is Night Dive too. Like they kind of
Yes.
came about, like you said, like Doom 2016, Dusk. Yeah, there were a couple things that happened, what, maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago. And Night
Yeah.
Dive, they're almost becoming like a household name now. And they've
Yeah.
done, I think, some pretty great work on a lot of retro games. I mean, no remaster is perfect, but it is pretty amazing to see Quake running and looking the way it does. Their remaster that they just released, because like you said, so many people, their first experiences with these games, they're playing at like 10 FPS with the ghosting. It's incomparable to what you see now. So yeah, there has been a resurgence. And I think people have realized to some degree, like when we were mentioning Call of Duty earlier, and you were kind of hinting at this, like the Call of Duty games are competent enough. It's not like they're
Mhm.
completely broken or something. Like they look good. They usually play pretty well, but they're just lacking that, like what you were talking about, that kind of personality, that artistic touch that so many of those 90s era FPS games have. You know, the annual Call of Duty sequels, they're competent games. They just don't have that personality that you get with Quake or Blood or Duke Nukem or Doom
Yeah,
64.
and perhaps part of it is the environments are becoming hyper realistic, where you look at the environment and then everything you see, you understand. It's like, oh yeah, that's a normal tree, that's a normal path, that's a normal
Yep.
car. So you're not interested at looking at it. With these classic games, there's abstraction to everything. So like Duke Nukem, there'll be like a sector kind of car there, and you're like, huh. So you look at that and it's like, how do they do that? What does that look like? And you go and explore it a little bit just to see its chunkiness. And with these abstract level designs, you miss things because it's not what you're used to seeing. And so you want to go back and look and get a feel of the area.
Right. Yeah. The abstract geometry. I mean, I'm thinking of classic Doom specifically. You're always surprised. You're always kind of caught off guard by what you're looking at or how it feels moving through the space. The secrets, like wall humping and just all this stuff. Like you're always on your guard. You can't outguess the game. You can't really outguess the level design. Whereas in a lot of more modern FPS games that are very, very linear, you can, because like you said, there's this realism to it. You
Yeah,
can anticipate what's coming around the corner because you're in like a simulation of reality.
yeah, like a brick wall is not going to suddenly vertically move up on you and open up a new space unless you hear a big explosion first.
Right. I'd love to hear your sort of extended elevator pitch for why Doom 64 is so special. Like, I get it, but to someone who's never played Doom 64 or has maybe missed or overlooked the game over the years, can you walk me through your thought process? Like, compare and contrast it to Doom 1 and Doom 2 and share why it's your personal favorite?
This is kind of like how I think, like at least like from the engine standpoint of how the things kind of evolved. So you had Doom engine, I guess that's just called idTech one, and the Wolf engine is just Wolf engine, but and that kind of started in 93. Then you also had his competitor, the build engine. But those engines, as games got made for them, things got added to them. They weren't just the same engine. And so you had the Doom branch continually evolving. Then they got dumped on console with the Atari Doom. That continued to evolve. And then it kind of ended up with Doom 64. And then on the build side, you ended up with Blood. Interestingly, both came out in 97. So Blood is like the darling of the build engine.
Right.
When you talk to anybody about who's really like a build engine fanatic, Blood's their favorite. Since the original Doom 1 and Doom 2 was such powerhouses, like they revolutionized the genre when they came out. So as when Doom 64 evolved to its spot in 97, it becomes compared to that. A lot of people do consider Doom 64 as the darling of that engine, but you're competing with games that revolutionize the genre in terms of Doom 1 and Doom 2. So often it does not get put on the same pedestal in the way that Blood does with the build engine. At that point in time, they kind of started to re-understood what you can do in the Doom engine. And with Doom 64 in particular, they built it for the Nintendo 64. So they had to build the maps without saves in mind. You couldn't save halfway in between. You had to start on the map and play it through as a continuous experience. So that kind of kept a lot of the level design in check that, hey, you can't put an hour-long map on there. You have to keep it like 15 minutes to 30 minutes. So that put a restriction. And, a lot of the best arts come from that kind of restriction and obeying it. And with Doom 64, they would send the levels to id and get their response on the levels as they were designing them. And the first round of Doom 64 levels were rejected. So the game got delayed and they rebuilt the levels. So you're not just seeing like people's first passes, you're seeing their second passes. And there's a lot of refinement that went in there where they're trying to push the classic shooter mechanics as far as they could, but keep it reasonable with the player, at least in most cases. And that's why you get to see like the puzzle elements in Doom 64. There's like that moving sphere. Yeah, and they had to build their own scripting system for that. So a lot of classic Dooms, you just walk over a spot and something happens. With Doom 64, you walk over a spot and a sequence happens where the level transforms in front of your eyes. And when you see a transforming level, then you start see like, okay, now anything can happen now. The rules are off the board. As I explore, things can change and can surprise me. And that makes you want to explore again and look around. Also, one thing that's nice with Doom 64 is like they had years to kind of balance the Doom formula. So Doom is known to have a good, pretty much formula in terms of using your super shotgun, your BFG, and rockets and stuff, and when you're attacking the enemies. But when Doom 2 came out, the super shotgun started kind of really dominating the combat. Doom 64 does a nice thing where, well, people are going to hate me for saying this. There's these small flying skulls that are very chaotic. They're called Lost Souls. In classic Doom, they were kind of slow moving. In Doom 64, they made them weaker but they made them faster and more aggressive. When you use a super shotgun, there's time to reload. If you shoot and if you don't kill the lost souls, they'll come in and attack you and start damaging you. And that kind of nerfs the super shotgun a bit. So now they introduced a higher rate of fire to the chain gun, where now you can start fighting off these lost souls. So it makes the chain gun useful. So there's a little bit more of a balance that's added where you're using more than just the super shotgun all the time. You're using the chain gun when you can. And if you run out of bullets there, then you can use the plasma as a backup. Then Doom 64 was on a small cartridge. So it was only 8 MB. So you had to be very creative. So as I mentioned before, that can either make you or break you. And with Doom 64, they started experimenting with like flipping textures and then applying another layer on top of that where you can shade textures different colors. So in Doom 64, when you're playing it, there's not a lot of textures there, but then they use a system to shade the textures all kinds of different colors. And that's why Doom 64 is known for being a particularly colorful game, where games after it, or actually around that time, because Quake was there, where they were limited by a palette. And they often appeared where you only have like a couple primary colors like browns and greens. With Doom 64, it was a true color renderer on N64. And so you have just all kinds of different colors on there. So the levels are very vibrant and uncanny. And that just makes me want to go back to it endlessly.
Oh, yeah. And I like how you noted that Blood is often looked at as the darling of the build engine games because of the things it did that older build games did not. And Doom 64 kind of parallels. There are so many cool lighting tricks. I mean, it was kind of running on a modified version of that original id engine. There's so many cool lighting tricks. You mentioned the colors, all new weapon and enemy designs. Midway actually brought back Gregor Punchatz, the original Doom demon modeler, to create the all new designs, some of which are really unique. I really love those Doom 64 demons. And like you said, they bring in Aubrey Hodges, who had created this very dark ambient soundtrack, kind of a soundscape almost for the PlayStation ports of Doom. And then he creates an all new soundtrack for 64. And I think that soundtrack has to be like one of the most ambitious experimental soundtracks or soundscapes, whatever you want to call it, that I've ever heard in a game.
Because he started working on the PlayStation Doom, and the problem is that the Doom levels were too big to fit in the PlayStation Doom RAM. So they had to dynamically load them from CD. Or if you're loading levels from the CD, you can't use the PlayStation's digital audio at the same time. So he had to come up with basically the PlayStation had a tracker format, but it was also related to MIDI. He had to come up with a way to play the level music in there. And so he came up with these loading up these small samples into the PlayStation RAM, but then down pitching them into these long soundscapes. And it became his own journey of exploring like what samples would and would not work. I mean, one of the samples came from a bee that flew into his Mountain Dew can. He quickly covered the can and went back into the studio and recorded buzzing around. And you can hear that in the PlayStation Doom and the Doom 64 soundtrack. And then he had a dying computer. And like, because I talked to him a while back and he explained to me that when you're picking out such sounds, you want things in the high frequencies that vary in interesting ways. And the high frequencies you down pitch, they become in the middle range where they become normal and interesting, and they start evolving into these soundscapes. And then he has all these weird sounds murmuring in the background, which help enhance like the groans of the demons in the background or the mechanics of these tech bases. And then he puts these moody strings ensembles and synth string ensembles on top of that. And as a musician myself, that influenced me to do the same thing and make my own music in that vein, because like at that time his music fits in the dark ambient genre, but he independently discovered it himself. He didn't know about that dark ambient genre at the time because it's so underground, and so there's nothing quite like that. And I listened to it so much, I was like, oh man, I wish I could find more. I couldn't, so I was like, well, I guess I just have to do it myself if I want more of it.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, like you said, there's sort of a very underground tradition of experimental noise, ambient music. Like when I first heard Aubrey's Doom 64 soundtrack, it made me think, I don't know if you've ever listened to the English band Coil. It kind of reminded me of their music a little bit. But yeah, there's really nothing else quite like it. And that's interesting. Like Doom 64, one of your favorite games, but then the soundtrack has also really inspired you musically too. Were you a musician prior to this, and then you kind of went in a different direction after hearing Aubrey's music?
When I started making music, it was in the early 2000s, and I was making MIDI music just on my own. And I was primarily influenced by three things. Lee Jackson, who did Rise of the Triad and some of the Duke Nukem 3D, and Kevin Schilder, who did Hexen and Heretic. So I would rip the MIDIs off there and just listen to them. And then I learned that, hey, I can edit these MIDIs and learn from them. So I started making MIDIs like that. And I was also into death metal at the same time because I was an edgy teen. So
which you still are, as you stated.
Yes. And so I started trying to do just kind of by ear, like what death metal would do in MIDI. But my focus was always like have it dark sounding and sinister sounding. So I started doing that with MIDI, and I had a bunch of old MIDIs. And I wish I knew about the Doom modding thing back then, because I could have just given them my MIDIs for their maps, but I didn't. I had no clue because I was such a console guy. I didn't know about modding on PC, so I missed out on all that early stuff. But now the Doom community has them now, and I'm surprised when they use them because it's such old stuff. Then I moved into a digital audio workstation, and I started fiddling around with Fruity Loops, and which I still sometimes use today. And then I would just explore various styles. All of it would have drums and beats and stuff that are vary from metal to rock to synthesizer stuff, but it always had a beat of something. Eventually I got kind of, I guess you could say, burned out because I was exploring, but I wasn't coming up with a style of my own then. That's like, because it says like, okay, this is good, but other people are making this kind of music and my stuff is not quite as polished. Then it was about the time when Doom 2016 came out. I was moving around a lot at that time because I just recently graduated college and I was taking various positions. I'm still kind of in that set mode right now where I'm like a nomad scientist moving around. I was having issues sleeping at the time. When you're moving around, you don't feel settled. So you're always kind of set slightly on edge. So I needed something to kind of take my mind off of it. And I started realizing that the Doom 64, the Quake 64, those Aubrey Hodges soundtracks that he made on the Nintendo 64 would take my mind into some other place. So a lot of people say that dark ambient helps them sleep. Some dark ambient musicians take offense to that. But the thing is, it's not because it doesn't help them sleep because it's bores them to sleep. It's because it takes their mind to a different world, because these dark ambient soundtracks are
really get you into a trance almost.
And so like there's before dark ambient came out, there was a genre called musica de concrete, and I'm probably getting the Latin mixed up on that, but there's artists that experimented with just droning tones, and they were often, people would say it reminded them of when they would do long periods of meditation. Well, also, I think like now with dark ambient now in the modern times, I think it replicates nature in a way where you have humming winds. Every now and then you have rustles of trees and branches. And I think the Doom 64 and the Quake 64 soundtracks do that too. And they do it to enhance the environment of the levels where you're in these facilities and stuff. So it takes my mind away from like living in the suburbs in some weird ass neighborhood, and it takes you and puts you into these very abstract environments where your imagination's going with what it could be. But then since you're thinking about it, you're full of wonder, and that calms you down and gets you in a good spot where you're like, okay, I can finally rest now because my mind's at ease. The problem is when you listen to dark ambient of a single soundtrack so much, you start anticipating it. It's like, okay, what if I try to make my own music, dark ambient music now, to fill in that gap? Because I just mostly did it for myself. I was greedy in that way. I was like, okay, I want to make music for myself. But the problem is, like, if you're hand composing it all yourself, well, of course you're going to anticipate it now because you made it. And at that time, I was doing data analysis and science. I was looking at waveforms and stuff. And these were from electromagnetic signals. I was analyzing those, but those are just basically represented in the same way that sounds are. I was like, okay, let me program my own synthesizer. And so I started just synthesizing like these waves and interpolating with them. Then I started adding, like, I can randomize how these waves are. So when it was all said and done, I had this synthesizer I programmed, and I could set it just to spit out these randomized sounds. And then I could start stacking these sounds. So then I started like, okay, this is where I want to go. It didn't end up quite like Aubrey Hodges soundtrack purely. Ends up being somewhere between like Doom 64 and the PC Quake 9-inch Nails soundtrack. It's not quite as repetitive, but it's in that middle space because I have this custom synthesizer for it. And Trent Reznor, when he was making the Quake soundtrack, did all kinds of weird things with synthesizers. It's like, yes, this is what I want to do because it's moody, it's edgy, it's foreboding, and it's all about just sounding like an alien world. And I was like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted. And then I never looked back.
Man, I appreciate you sharing that insight too about like the mental and emotional benefits you found in ambient music and the parallels with nature and such. Like, I definitely know what you mean. And with those gaming soundtracks, even the older stuff like the midis, there's such a like texture almost, to the way that those sound. And there really is nothing else like it. I think, like we've been talking about, it just further adds to the personality that these games have. It's just so unique. I mean, you could be anywhere. You could be anywhere doing anything. And even if you didn't have the visual, if you just heard certain sound effects or certain tracks from Doom, you'd be able to identify it right away. Do you just curious, do you have a preference between Doom 1 and Doom 2? Like if we're just talking the base games, is there one you prefer over the other?
So I love the super shotgun.
Right.
I whenever the super shotgun's included, I like having it.
Especially that Doom 2 super shotgun. I know it's kind of OP, but that is like maybe the most satisfying weapon in video game history.
Yeah. Now Doom 1 lacks that, but I tend to like a lot of how the Doom 1 tech bases are. Maybe it's that John Romero's horseshoe design. So if you look at E1M1,
yep,
you can there's like a horseshoe where you start off at one end of the horseshoe, there's a courtyard, and then on the other side the horseshoe is the exit. And so that kind of just seeing like there's a courtyard there, it puts enough variability in the environment to think it's real. Yeah, so for some reason the Doom 1 levels stick out to me more, but then the Doom 2 weapon, like the super shotgun, sticks out to me. So it's kind of weird, because like Doom 64 has a super shotgun as well, but maybe the tech bases in Doom 64 more akin to Doom 1. I don't know. Yeah.
Right.
So there's like,
well, and then in Doom 2, you have like the better enemy variety too. You have the couple of new demons, you have the Archvile, you have Revenants. So yeah, it's interesting. And then if you throw in like I don't know if you've played Thy Flesh Consumed in the master levels, but those make things even more interesting. Like if you factor those into your preferences. Yeah, I feel like both have their kind of their strengths and weaknesses. Like you have to play both, like they're both still to this day worth playing through.
Each one has multiple level designers, and you get to experience them in different light as you progress through the levels. That's what makes it interesting. It's not each person's the master of their own level and they do what they want. So you get this variety.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you brought up, because we were talking about level design earlier, Romero's horseshoe concept. I think I've played enough classic Doom that I'm almost like involuntarily looking for that in any game I play. Like, when I'm like, running through a level or something. Yes. I've heard him describe that before. And it is a great idea. I mean, it really is that, a straight line's boring and a complete circle's boring, because that comes back in the first level in Quake 1 as well. That first base horseshoe design again. And it just makes your experience as the player more exciting, and it makes the experience less predictable. And it's just a unique way to move through a three-dimensional space, or even in classic Doom, sort of a pseudo three-dimensional space.
And like, so one of the problems for a while there, you had to have these corridors, because if the player could see too far, too much would be rendering on the screen. So that kind of defined the first-person shooters between 2000s and 2000 and up until like mid 2010s, where if you had a draw distance that was too far, then it would tank the game frame rate. So you had to have these like corridor experiences where you couldn't see too far. I took that kind of to heart where you can like see as far as like almost like seeing the exit, like that horseshoe. With my first map, I took that to heart where I'm kind of have this the player start off in this little canyon badland area, but off in the distance you see a tower. But my intention of that is like, oh, a player can see that tower in the distance. I hope they feel like they want to get to that tower and explore it. And once they get there, they realize, oh, the tower's locked off. But if I explore the caves nearby, maybe I can find the key to open it up. And then I reward the player at the end by letting them get into the tower and explore it.
Right. Yeah, that's a great idea, because then once you're at the tower, you can kind of look back and get a sense of where you've come from. The map starts to feel more cohesive. You understand the space you've moved through, and that's what leads to a satisfying experience when you're playing a game, for sure.
Yeah. So we talked about that era of levels, and the levels themselves were almost like puzzles because they were not funneling you through. That's kind of like how I describe my level. It's a 30-minute, like 15 to 30-minute puzzle where you have the enemies there, and the enemies, you want to destroy them, getting through them to get further ahead on this puzzle, which is the level itself, because you're unlocking doors and you're trying to figure out, how do I actually maneuver my way through this geometry to make it to that part of the path. And so it becomes multi-layered. It's not just about the combat, it's also about the puzzle of the level itself.
And you mentioning again the 15 to 30-minute thing, it has me thinking about Doom Eternal. I guess just to complain a little bit, I had a lot of fun with Doom Eternal. I really did. And I think Doom Eternal is a really innovative FPS game. Like, they really did bring new ideas to the table.
All my young friends love it.
But the more I've played it, the more time that's passed, it is like, this just isn't timeless to me in the way that Quake 1 is, in the way that, Doom 1, Doom 2, Doom 64 is. And I think one of the reasons I feel that way is because of how long some of the levels are. And that doesn't mean I don't want challenge. I love challenge. I love when games have a skill-based learning curve. Like, I want that. But some of Doom Eternal's master levels can take like over an hour to complete. And it's just like, they almost lose me with that.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is like, when you're 3 minutes in, it's like, I'm still in the middle. I haven't got any kind of reward yet for all this effort I put into it. Because when you're young, you have more of a sense like, I invested so much into this now, I gotta see it through. When you're older, you're like, I'm too old to do this kind of investment. I'm just gonna bail. So I think you become less patient with things like that. And I think maybe that's why, at least I've noticed, like, there's like somewhat of an age gap. I mean, and that's always a generalization, because everything's like the most basic assumption of bell curve, but that Eternal skews younger to the younger audience, and then 2016 and then the more classic FPS skew more to an older. Well, I would say 2016 is in the middle. Then Doom 64, the classic Dooms, skew towards an older audience. And I think so. If I had to recommend any Doom for people to start off with, I would say start off with Doom 2016, because then you would know like which direction you want to go, where you want to go, classic or modern. But then as people age, the kids might continue want to play Doom Eternal, but then as they age, they might want to go, okay, now let's go play some more of these classic levels. And the cycle continues. Hopefully we'll see in 10 years if the retro FPS is still cycling around. But
I almost see 2016 as like a bit of a gateway drug, for games like that. And it's funny because when Eternal first came out and I first got my hands on it, it's like, oh man, this just obliterates 2016. 2016 can't keep up with this. I've heard Hugo Martin even compare it to, like a Lamborghini or a Ferrari. And it's like, Doom 2016 is like an SUV, and Eternal, it's a Lamborghini. It's a McLaren. It's crazy. But then the more I've actually played it, I actually think deep down I prefer 2016. I actually like 2016 because I think it's a little more rooted in those retro ideals in terms of the design, the way you move through the levels. It's a little more cinematic artistically, it's a little more, I don't know, I just think of like weather effects and the color palette of that game. And I think I prefer it. I don't know, it's a very interesting thing. And actually, I recently just played, I had never played this until like 2 weeks ago, but I played John Romero's Sigil, his 9 map mega wide. Have you played that?
Yes.
I had heard really mixed things. I was suspicious. of the negative talk I had heard because it mostly centered around difficulty. I had heard a lot of people just say, well, these maps are too hard. I didn't like it. And I mean, it was interesting seeing in Sigil how Romero was, it's like Doom 1 WAD, but he's using some technology that was not available
Yes,
in 1993, which I thought was
the level editor, which makes it
right.
much more. You have to use less imagination, when building your maps. It's a little bit closer to what you see is what you get, and that gives you more creative freedom to become more complicated in your designs.
Right. Romero has a reputation for being a little trolly at times with his levels. And I don't know that they're my favorite Doom maps, but I mean, I had a good enough time with it. And I thought some of the complaints about difficulty were a little silly because if the game's primary level designer is going to release a new map pack almost 30 years later, why would you want that to be a cakewalk? Wouldn't you want that to feel kind of new? Wouldn't you want to be tested in some new way? So I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought it was an interesting experience. Well, and speaking of Romero, I know you've been playing some Daikatana, and we were going back and forth about that online the other day. And yeah, I mean, I think the game certainly has some issues, but its hate, I do think, was a bit overblown. I think it did get some things right, interestingly enough. But is what I think is cool is that you've been playing the N64 version.
Yes, I'm an N64 addict.
Well, right. You strike me as somebody who's like really into those original aesthetics of those console versions. Like you strike me as somebody you like to emulate that experience that you actually would have had with the game 20 years ago. Is that right?
Yes, I guess you could say that, because it's a weird path I've gone down to where the more I degrade the visuals, the more I can make it because I like reducing the resolution, but my new favorite thing is adding dithering to things.
Oh yeah.
So where you had these patterns, these noise-like patterns, these hatch-like patterns, where the pixels would flip colors to give like a smoother edge, but it was also a grainy edge, and that grain suggests that there's something hiding underneath there, that there's extra details that are there that are actually not there. So I've been playing at half resolution Quake with dithering on, and so you're not overly blowing up, stretching out a texture to make it look like a blurry mess. You're having a little bit of a pixel edge to it that makes you think okay, there's probably more detail in there that I can't see, even though that there's not. I don't know, maybe I'm just tricking my brain into thinking okay, this is looking, this aesthetic is putting more detail into the game than there actually is.
Well, I have you here, Morpher. Are there any WADs or just any community created content for any of these games we've been talking about, Doom 64, 1, 2, Quake, anything you'd recommend that you really like if people are getting into these games and they haven't even delved into community content?
Yeah, so I love Doom 64, and I think in a close second is Quake. So I play a lot of Quake maps too. I used to always love, and I still love them, was the Quake Halloween map jams.
Oh yeah,
where it's a yearly Halloween map jam, and it's a bunch of mappers that get together and build maps for a month, and then you start off at a hub and you can choose maps in any order. So if you don't like a map, you can bail out and go back to that hub and start a different map and get a completely different experience. I think probably most people, when they start getting into custom maps and stuff, they probably would start with maybe like Doom 1, Doom 2. If you're not aware of it, each year on Doom World, there is the Kako Awards. So it's basically where they recognize creators that year or in the past that have really put in a lot of effort in there. And you can start finding a lot of good map sets and stuff on there. And one of the ones I'll point out, which won Kako Awards probably, is it 3 years now, is Of Eternity by Dragonfly. Because and on there you have not just Dragonfly, you have all kinds of co-mappers as well, and then you can get a feel of which mappers you like and which ones to further explore, just like the Doom 2016.
Sure.
So I recommend Of Eternity, and it runs on most Doom ports. So whether you want GZ Doom with a modern renderer or one like Boom or something like that, you can go either way with that. Then with Doom 64, I can list off probably a few recommendations, but if you liked the Doom 64 experience, but you want more levels in the same vein, there's a map set called Beta 64. And that's 31 and a half maps. So there's an unfinished map there. So that's the joke that's always in beta because there's an unfinished map. If you want more Doom 64, but you want to experience it in a more detailed fashion, well, there is Doom 64 CE. You can find it on ModDB. Adds all kinds, so it has gradient lighting. It has all kinds of fancy graphics and shiny, and it looks awesome. But there's also Doom 64 Reloaded, so that's not quite finished yet. It's going to be finished in the end of February, right before the Doom 64's 25th anniversary, where Atomic Frog went in and added all kinds of more geometry, lighting. There's bonus levels. I think there's up to 50 maps in it now. Now you get to experience Doom 64 in a new way again. You get to explore around different corners. You get to find new secret exits, new secret levels. There's interesting new changes to enemy placements where it kind of surprises you in different ways. If you want to experience something that's more creative, more that might blow your mind, because we talked a little bit about Doom 64's rendering system.
Right.
It has what they called gradient colored lighting, sector lighting, and no other game has that. As far as I've asked around, no one has seen that kind of lighting system. And that lighting system lets you have sharp color transitions, but also these gradients that go up the walls where you can go from red to blue and all these wild colors. Swiba, who also goes by Ryath, has made this map set called The Unmaking. He really explores what you can do with this rendering system. And I remember the first time he asked me, because if someone needs help with Doom 64 modding, my DMs are always open to help advise you where you need to go. And he had this texture which was just white, just a white texture. It's just the most bland as you can get. And he sent it to me. He's like, "Can you get this in the game?" And I was like, "I think I can." So it took us a while to figure out how to mod these things in, but we figured it out. And then what he did with it was he used it to enhance the Doom 64's lighting system. You get all these wild colors, these weird abstract geometry, these puzzle-like levels where the levels themselves have this puzzle element enhanced where you have to think outside the box. So if you want to something where it's going to really surprise you and you don't know where it's going to take you, I'd recommend finding The Unmaking.
We've previously grumbled to one another about the state of the video game industry and, kind of shared our jadedness when it comes to things like, game awards. And I know it's like a huge, broad, kind of impossible question, but like, I know you're having fun over in your little corner of the universe playing, Daikatana on the N64 in 2022, but like, which I really appreciate that about you. But yeah, when you look at the gaming landscape right now, what do you make of things?
Yeah. So I think they're starting to really realize that there's different gaming cultures and that you can tap into the culture and all you need to do is make games in that culture. So like the retro FPS, there's indie companies, Night Dive, New Blood, 3D Realms that are realizing, hey, if we can make games these people like, we don't need to be AAA. We can make a good living just selling to this subculture here. But then also, like, I can see that the AAA games kind of have diverged a bit. So like I kind of got stuck in the late 90s where the games that are being made by independent publishers, now if you port them back to the 90s, they would be considered AAA, and the AAA has gotten so big that it's a different beast than when I was growing up. So now what happens in AAA does not affect me as much. Like when Microsoft buys these big companies, they don't really make games I play anymore. Like you said, I'm in my little corner and it's not just playing 1997 games. I'm playing a Medieval. I'm playing Dusk. I'm playing Proteus. I got a Proteus shirt on right now. I'm not just stuck in 97. There's all these games that are being released now in early access now or coming out in the next few years that I'm looking forward to. Yeah.
Landscape.
Yeah.
Like he designed that entire game by himself. And it's on Switch now, right? It's like, relatively speaking, Switch. It's been a really successful retro style FPS game. And one guy made that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the corporate culture there for those big companies is bigger than it ever was.
Right.
But it's like two like divergent rivers. Sometimes the corporate culture is getting worse, but now the indie games are getting better and more recognized, and more people like playing them. You got indie games coming out on the Switch and all the major consoles.
Yeah, it's encouraging. It's a good sign.
Yeah, it's a good sign. And even though I'm not playing the AAA's games as much as I would do in the 90s, I still have the games that are just as good quality as the 90s, or even better sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm the same. I just want to play a good game. I don't care if it's AAA. I don't care if it's indie. I just want good games. So wherever the good games come from, that's where I'm going to go.